So thanks for the opportunity to speak today. So I'm on the camera, it looks like. I think I can see myself there. So I'm, as Torsten said, a graduate of the UBC MD PhD program. I graduated in 2008, which to me seems like it was just yesterday, but I guess it was 7 years ago. So it shows you how time goes by. And I've just recently started, about 2 months ago, back at UBC as a faculty member. So I don't think I've met any of you actually before. So it's surprising how fast the turnover is. But what year are people in?
It's through year 5, year 6.
Okay, so some people are starting their clinical clerkship.
Nobody here is actually engaged in a clinical clerkship yet.
Okay.
When you search so 3.
Yeah. And how many students are in? Is this everyone, or there's more?
No, it's about 24 now.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah. So back in the day when I was an MD PhD student, there was only 2 students in my year, and I think there was like 5 students in the whole program for most of the time. So it's great to see how it's grown. So I thought what I would talk about is sort of some aspects of what happens when you finish your MD PhD and then some stages of training after that, and you start thinking about looking for a job, because that was kind of sort of fresh on my mind. Although I looked at your website and I saw that Paul Young gave a talk in January on a very similar topic, and he shared his slides with me, and they were actually much better than my slides. So I've tried to sort of change it so it's not going to be too repetitive of what you all have already heard. And this is meant to be very informal, so just interrupt me at any point. And I think I'd first like to say, sometimes I think when we talk about sort of job stuff, I'm hopefully it's not going to seem in any way, bleak or in terms of the prospects for a job, because I think it definitely is. And I think often in medicine we hear about the fact that there's, can be challenges in getting specific types of jobs that you want. But I think to a large extent, those kind of concerns don't really apply as much to you guys, because you're a very unique group. And I think it's certainly, I feel that as a clinician scientist, I'm incredibly fortunate to get to be doing what I'm doing, and I'm very grateful to have had the training that I did in the MD PhD program, which was really an incredibly exciting and rewarding period in my life. So I'm going to start off, I think, by just giving a bit of an overview, and just as a caveat also, everything I say is purely my own opinion and take on things, and I would say is not in any sense kind of authoritative or definitive, and is also fairly unique to, I think, my particular experiences, which are really limited, I'd say, to UBC and to the National University of Singapore, where I was immediately prior to coming here. Although I do have a little bit of experience with some other institutions in Canada and the United States. But things vary quite a lot from institution to institution, so some things that I say may not apply to other places that you might be looking. So I think just in terms of like kind of a framework, when you think about what might come after MD PhD program, obviously you guys are in this box right now of doing your MD PhD program, your research projects as part of your PhD work. I think probably most of you, after completing your MD PhD, will enter some sort of residency program. That's really what I did, which, depending on what residency you do, could be anywhere from actually 2 to 5 years. And you may be involved in some research activities during your residency. I was, to some extent. Some schools have something called a hemi-doc program or something similar that allow you to carve out some research time in your residency. Usually after that residency program, you'd enter a clinical fellowship, which can be anywhere from usually 2 to 4 years, but could be potentially longer. And either concurrently or subsequent to your clinical fellowship, you may do some additional research training through something called the Clinician Investigator program, which is something I did that I'm happy to tell you about a little bit. Or some people will even go on to do a more traditional postdoctoral fellowship. And so, just thinking about the number of years, residency can be, as I said, 3 to 5 years. Fellowship could be another 2 to 4 years. Then you're up to potentially, 5 to 9 years. And then when you add CIP or a postdoc, that's kind of another 2+ years. So this could be a period of your life that's anywhere from about, I guess in my case, 7 years to 10+ years. And I think, one of the things that surprised me a little bit when I got to this phase of finishing my clinical fellowship is that my PhD actually at that point seemed like it was quite far away in terms of the research that I'd done, some of the techniques that I was doing, the papers that I published, which I still was obviously very proud of some of those accomplishments, but they were no longer as current as they had been a few years previously. So I think when you get to the point that you're now starting to think about going onto the job market, you may be confronted with actually realizing that you need to have another block of research time to try to develop a sort of more contemporary research track record and generate some preliminary data that would then allow you to apply for competitive operating grants. And so I think that's where things like CIP or maybe even doing a postdoc come into play. So I'll tell you a little bit about just what I did, just for reference, not because it's meant to be anything other than that. I grew up in Winnipeg, and I did a bachelor's degree at the University of Manitoba in science. I then came out to UBC in 2001 and did the MD PhD program between 2001 and 2008. After that, I did residency in internal medicine, also at UBC. That was 3 years for the core internal medicine residency program, 2008 to 2011. I then did a 2-year fellowship in general internal medicine that was primarily based at UBC, although actually it was sort of all over the province, and I spent some time in other places. I then did the clinician investigator program, which I actually overlapped partially with my clinical fellowship, so I was able to use some portion of my clinical fellowship as research time for the clinician investigator program, which is normally a 2-year program. And for that, although I was being funded by UBC, I was actually physically based in Singapore at the National University of Singapore. And then sort of during my time in Singapore, I took on a role there as a junior faculty member with my own small research group, and that was up until just a couple of months ago. And now just in March of this year, I've started back at UBC as an assistant professor. So that's kind of what I did, and I sort of, to some extent, I think follows that general framework that I showed. I think one thing that I've sort of done that I feel maybe in some ways was helpful is I've tended to always sort of do multiple different things at the same time, which I think you get very good at as an MD PhD student, because especially the way the UBC program is structured, that it's fairly integrated. You're sort of going back and forth between medical school and graduate school. And I think that allows you to be a little bit more efficient with your time than if you just do things totally concurrently. And so I did something similar with my fellowship, and actually became a professor while I was still a fellow, which I think technically was not allowed, but I didn't tell people about it. So now I can tell you about it, because I'm no longer a fellow. And I think I was able to sort of be a little bit more efficient with my time. So I think, in thinking about negotiating or applying for the kind of position you'd want to have when you eventually finish all these various stages of your training, it's helpful to consider a little bit about what kind of position you might want to have and what the different types of positions are out there. And so I think probably for most people that would come from an MD PhD background, you'd really want to have an academic appointment at a university. And there's various different streams that you can be appointed to or sort of be slotted into. I think the most kind of traditional academic professor position would be what's called a tenure track position, where you typically be funded by the university on what they call university money, which is hard money that's sort of a line item in the university budget and allows you to apply for promotion and tenure. Oh, what happened?
Probably the connection.
See if it comes back. There we go. I think in many universities, those tenure track positions are becoming harder to come by, and depending a little bit on exactly what kind of role you're going to play, I think that may or may not be what you would aspire to. But I think that's in some ways kind of the gold standard in terms of the very traditional academic professor track that you might want to consider. There's also something called grant tenure track, which is very similar, except you're funded at least in part by non-university funds or funds that aren't considered hard funds. At UBC, there's something called partner track, where your funding comes entirely from an organization outside of the university, which could be a healthcare authority or a clinical entity. And then there's also something that's fairly distinct, I'd say, from that academic assistant professor track, which is being clinical faculty, where you could be appointed as a clinical assistant professor. And that kind of position, at least to my understanding and from my experience, generally would not include any salary, so you're not getting paid for that, and you probably don't have all of the advantages or benefits that you would have as really an academic faculty member. But again, depending on exactly what kind of position you're applying for, that might be something that could be appropriate. So in addition to your academic appointment, you also likely will need to obtain a faculty appointment in a clinical division. So, just the way that the university is structured, there's departments like the Department of Medicine, the Department of Surgery, etc. And then within the departments, there's clinical divisions. So within medicine, there's the Division of General Internal Medicine, which I'm in, the Division of Cardiology, Division of Nephrology, etc. In addition to that, you'll also need a clinical appointment at whatever clinical setting you're working in. So either at a hospital, you need to obtain privileges as a physician, or in whatever clinical unit you're going to be working in. And then depending on what university you're at, you may or may not require also an appointment at a university center. So UBC tends to be quite center-based in that, the Department of Medicine doesn't necessarily have any physical research space, but researchers that are within the Department of Medicine are affiliated or appointed at various centers within the university. So there's, the Center for Child and Family Research, CFRI. There's the center I'm at, the Center for Heart and Lung Innovation. There's the Brain Research Center, etc. And again, that varies from university to university, but at UBC, generally, that's how that would look. And so, this came as a little bit of a surprise to me, is that it's not so much kind of one job that you're looking for, but multiple different jobs. And actually, to a fairly significant extent, that these different components of your job are going to be contributed to or committed by different individuals. So it can actually get a little bit confusing when you think about who you're actually having your negotiations with. And hopefully there'll be sort of one person that will be the contact person that will take primary responsibility for all of the different commitments that you would need to obtain. But likely you'll be having conversations with several different people. And so the different kind of appointments that I talked about, in terms of your main university appointment, normally that would be something that would be committed to by the head of the department that you want to be appointed in, potentially also together with some sort of recruitment committee. And that appointment, as I said, is quite crucial because they'll pay your salary, at least your academic salary. That appointment will provide you with the ability to be part of the faculty benefits program that includes things like extended medical benefits, pension benefits, the ability to apply for promotion and tenure on the academic track, and also, I think very important for us, the ability to be associated with a graduate program to take on and train graduate students. So that's sort of obviously a very crucial part of the type of position that you'd want to have as a clinician scientist. The clinical appointment will be often negotiated or provided by a different individual who would be the head of your clinical division. So like in my case, the division head for general internal medicine. You need that appointment may or may not have any funding associated with it, but it's essential that you're part of the clinical faculty to fulfill your role as a clinician. They may provide you with some parts of your space, so clinical space or maybe even research space, and probably administrative assistance, because I think many of the departments leave it up to the divisions to provide administrative assistance to the faculty members. And they may contribute to your salary if there is something called an AFP, which we'll get back to, and they may also contribute to some of the startup funding that you require. The center appointment will again be often provided by different individuals, so usually the director of whatever center you may want to become affiliated with. So like in my case, it was sort of, I started by talking to my department head, and he basically said, you tell me where you want to be at UBC to do your research. And so it was kind of up to me to identify what I thought would be the most appropriate research group to become associated with. And so in my case, I decided that the HLI at St. Paul's for me would be the best space. And so then that became another discussion with the director of the HLI. And that appointment is very crucial because typically they'll be the ones that provide you with your lab space. And so physical lab space, especially if you need wet lab space for your research, is obviously at a real premium at many universities, including UBC. So having a commitment for the type of lab space that you need is really crucial. They'll probably also provide some component of administrative support for you to do your work, and they'll likely also contribute to the startup funding that's going to be committed to you. And then lastly, the hospital appointment formally is normally done through the medical affairs office for whatever hospital or clinic you need to be part of. This often there's not a whole lot of negotiation that goes into it, but you need to certainly secure this and fulfill whatever requirements they would set out in order for you to be appointed as a clinical, essentially as a physician at that site. So this is obviously necessary. If you want to see patients at BGH, you need to have privileges as a physician at BGH. You're not actually employed by BGH, but you're essentially have the privilege to go into BGH and see patients. If you're doing a very procedurally oriented medical activity, then obviously it becomes very critical to have whatever OR time or clinic time or endoscopy time or whatever it is that you need to actually play your clinical role. And likely you might need some administrative support in that aspect as well. So after you've had kind of all of these conversations with all the different people that are involved in putting together the package that would be required to support someone as a clinician scientist, typically you'll receive a letter of offer. And so this is really the formal statement of the various commitments that are being made to you by the university and by all these affiliated organizations. Usually it seems to come in a draft format first that allows you to have some back and forth and negotiate on certain points before it will really be finalized and signed by all the signing parties. And some of the things that it would typically contain would certainly be the start date of your appointment, what exactly your position is, what your title is going to be. Are you going to, assistant professor, associate professor? Are you tenure track, grant tenure track, partner track, etc.? It will probably have some outline of what your clinical time commitment is going to be. So that could be number of weeks a year that you're going to be attending on a clinical service, or number of half days per week, depending on exactly what it is. It will likely describe the physical space that's going to be allocated to you in terms of laboratory space and office space and clinical space. It will hopefully describe whatever administrative assistance is going to be provided to you in order to do both your clinical and your academic works. It will outline what your salary is going to be and what benefits you might be eligible for. It will usually have there'll be some documentation of what your deliverables are, so what are the milestones that you're expected to achieve. And then it will have some timeline in terms of when you need to meet those deliverables, when you would come up for renewal, and when you're eligible or when you actually need to apply for promotion and tenure. Because on a sort of traditional assistant professor tenure track route, depending on the university, you generally need to apply and be promoted to associate professor within the first kind of 4 to 6 years of your appointment in order to continue on with that position. So once you receive your letter of offer, often they're quite long. I think the two universities that have the most experience with in Singapore and UBC. I think the Singapore one was relatively short. It was maybe 5 or 6 pages or something. The UBC one was like 30 pages, so it took me like a week to actually read through it. And then by the time I got to the end, I forgot most of what I had read at the beginning, so I had to read it a few times to actually try to figure out exactly what it was saying. But it's obviously essential to read it very carefully and to really think about is what is being offered to you what you need in order for you to be successful in your role. And I think it's important to realize that most of the things that are going to be outlined in this letter of offer are negotiable. And this is really, the time in your career when you're probably in the best situation to actually negotiate for the things that you need and, maybe the things that you want. My experience has been that if you do request things or request changes to some of the things that they've outlined in the letter, they will listen to that and they will take your requests very seriously. They may not say yes to all of them, but this is definitely the time to try to get these commitments into a form that you are comfortable with and that you think is providing you with the level of support that's going to be sufficient for you to do your work, to enjoy your work, and to really flourish as a clinician scientist. So how will you get paid? And I notice I'm not saying how much will you get paid, but just what is the mechanism by which you might get paid? Because as you go on in your career and you maybe get married or have children or buy a house, you realize that this actually becomes an important consideration. Who will actually be paying you? I know when I was an MD PhD student, I don't know what the stipend is now, but when I went from being an undergraduate student to an MD PhD student, our stipend was $21,000 a year. I felt just like rich. And then when I got the Michael Smith Award and it was an extra $7,000, I was just like, I didn't know what to do with all the money that I had. So things change a little bit as you move on with your life, and maybe your rent goes up, or you have to start buying diapers. Is that right? Wow, that's terrible. Because I was paying. Because now there's there's like the Vanier one and stuff that are more. Yeah.
But that's for a certain period of time, and not everybody gets one.
So it's still 20,000.
But yeah, the basic one is 20,000.
Yeah. And what's tuition now for a PhD? It hasn't gone up that much, right?
It hasn't gone up for our students.
Yeah, the MD is like 16,000.
Right. Yeah. So how will you get paid? Well, you'll hopefully have, if you're able to secure that kind of academic faculty position, so either as a tenure track or a grant tenure track, there will be some salary attached to that. It's, I think there's some room to negotiate around that. I don't think you're going to change it massively. There's sort of a range that it will fall into, and I think many universities have used some sort of formula or have some scale by which they'll, determine what your starting salary is based on your, years of experience and to some extent how competitive they feel you are as a candidate. You can find out what those numbers are. Some advice that I was given that I found actually fairly helpful was to just talk to the UBC Faculty Association and just ask them for new assistant professors in the Department of Medicine, what's the median, the minimum, and the maximum starting salary, and they'll just give you those numbers, and then you can just know, am I, at least within the range. You don't want to be the least well-paid person, but the range, in my experience, was not huge. So you will have some salary from your academic position, and that will generally be enough for you to buy a small closet in Vancouver, so that's nice. But it's probably might not be, the total part of your salary. You might feel that you would like to, have slightly more means than are provided by that salary. And so in a fee-for-service system, and you may or may not realize that in British Columbia, almost all physicians are on a fee-for-service basis, which means that as a physician, you're an independent contractor. You're essentially a small business owner, whether or not you're incorporated, and you bill the medical services plan for every item of healthcare delivery that you're involved in delivering, and then they pay you. There's some exceptions to that. So some physicians are on a salary system at the cancer agency, other places where they've negotiated a salary system, but the vast majority of physicians in the province are on a fee-for-service system. And typically, your earnings, your clinical earnings from that fee-for-service work you do would be on top of what you earn in your academic position. So that's one of the sort of nice things as a clinician scientist, at least in the situation in British Columbia, is that you have sort of multiple sources of remuneration. This is very different, for instance, than the position I came from in Singapore, where they give you one salary that's meant to recognize all of your contributions, and whether you're 100% clinical or 100% research or anywhere in between, you get one number, and that recognizes everything you do. So it's obviously very different in this fee-for-service system, where if you're 100% research, you would have your academic salary and potentially nothing else. And the more clinical work you do, obviously, the greater that piece of your salary becomes. So there's some good parts about that. I'd say there's a lot of parts of that system that are not necessarily ideal as a clinician scientist, because it tends to create incentives for you to spend a lot of time doing clinical work, which tends to be very highly remunerated, and potentially less time doing some of your academic work, which tends to be much less well remunerated. But that is how it often will work here in British Columbia. Some places, so other jurisdictions, as I mentioned, Singapore, and some clinical divisions at UBC or elsewhere will have something called an alternative funding plan, which is a mechanism to share or distribute funds within an organizational unit, like a clinical division. So in some places that have very well-established AFPs, like at the University of Calgary, if you start as an academic physician there, you'll just get a salary, and that will, again, recognize all of your research and clinical contributions. And that funding usually comes from the clinical earnings from the entire division that are pooled and then distributed, and potentially with some other contributions from government or university or other sources. And so I think if you're part of a organizational unit that has an academic or an alternative funding plan, that can be quite nice as a clinician scientist, because it provides you with a relatively more stable and predictable stream of income than you would have if you're on this sort of hybrid academic and fee-for-service structure that actually most people at UBC are at. And then an important component of your remuneration that, again, you may not be giving a lot of thought to now, but when you get to the point in your careers of actually looking for a faculty position, are actually the benefits. And so this is one of, I'd say, the advantages of having an academic appointment with the university, because, again, as a physician, if you're a fee-for-service physician, you get zero benefits from anyone. So that you have, I'm sure pension is like the last thing in the world you guys are thinking about, but at some point in your life, a long time away from now, you may want to retire and continue to have some money to pay your rent or go on vacations, and so that money needs to come from somewhere. And if you don't have a pension because you're a physician, then you would have had to have saved up all of your money to use in retirement, which requires obviously a lot of planning and for you to be very committed. And also for the stock market to be better than it seems to be right now. So having some sort of pension where there's some other stream of funding for you to carry on with your life in your retirement years is quite nice. Medical and dental benefits are quite important. Relocation expenses are really key, especially if you're coming from somewhere far away. So for me to come from Singapore, obviously it cost some amount of money to bring my whole family and to ship all of our things. Not that we had that many things, but to ship anything from Singapore to Vancouver is quite expensive. So I was happy that I wasn't paying out of pocket for all of that. There may be some funding that you can use for conferences or other sort of educational things. Many universities will have some tuition benefits for your dependents, which are quite nice. And there might be some housing benefits, which, again, in a city like Vancouver or somewhere else that you might be thinking of that's fairly expensive to live in, is important. UBC does have some housing benefits for faculty, although I think they're generally considered to be, they haven't really kept up with the cost of housing in Vancouver, but I suppose it's better than nothing. So that's a little bit about getting paid. I think the other component, that really forms a big part of the negotiation when you start looking for jobs that I think is actually, much more important than the salary part is the startup funds. And, especially if your research tends to be something that costs, a fair bit of money to do. So if you do a lot of, animal work, which is hugely expensive, or a lot of sequencing or something else that's fairly resource intensive, then obviously you need to have some funds for you to be able to do that research in at least the first year or two of your appointment while you're applying for external operating grants. You guys may or may not have a good sense right now of how much your research costs your graduate supervisor. You might want to ask them sometime, how much did they spend on all your reagents and consumables and maybe technical support time that went to your work. You'll probably be surprised how much it costs to actually do research. And so having that funding for the first part of your faculty appointment is really crucial. I think one thing that I found to be super helpful was when I started talking to people about startup funds, it was to have a very detailed budget. Really in like CIHR grant style that you could show to the people that you're negotiating with and tell them this is how much you need, and really be able to justify this is why you need each of those items. Because if you go in and just say I need 100,000 or 500,000, it's pretty easy for the university to come back and say, well, maybe we'll give you 50,000 or what. But if you say I need 36,000 in year one to hire a technician, and I need $160 times 5,000 patients to do my genotyping, and etc., then I think it builds a much more compelling case and really provides, just makes it much more serious in terms of what you were requesting. And so that was definitely my experience, is that when I went in with a very detailed budget, I actually found that the response was quite good. And certainly, comparing, I think, what was initially on the table kind of just before I provided any input to what we finally got to, I was surprised to see how far we went. And I think that was largely because, to some extent, I think I was able to justify what I thought I needed. I think this is one portion of the startup that can be quite variable. I'm not aware of there being like a fixed number or even a range that the university sets aside for new faculty. That's not the case, for instance, in Singapore. At the National University of Singapore, every new faculty was allocated $200,000 for startup funds over the first 2 years, so it's much more transparent and predictable. I think at UBC, and from what I understand from talking to some of my colleagues who are recently negotiated positions at other Canadian universities, it tends to be much a little bit more opaque in terms of how much everyone gets for their startup. I think you need to really, when you're thinking about how much startup you might need, you need to consider different what are the different costs of doing your research. So salary, because you're hopefully going to hire at least a technician or a postdoc, and graduate students, you might have to pay some component of their salary. Obviously, the consumables and operating costs for you to do your research. And then equipment costs. And equipment is obviously very expensive and may, depending on what equipment you need, be outside of the scope of what is sort of reasonable to ask for in terms of startup. So I think it's also important when you're looking at the research unit or center you want to be affiliated with to consider what's available to shared equipment. What equipment do you need to do your research, and what infrastructure is already there. There's some...
You were writing up a grant at this point, I bet?
I had a grant, yeah. So I basically just took my budget from that, yeah. So that was helpful because I didn't, because I sort of already had it kind of in a format that was easy to use for this. Yeah. There are some, besides what is committed to you by the university, there are some other sources of startup funds that are helpful to just be aware of or to think about. So again, in Singapore, there was one grant specifically earmarked for new assistant professors that you had to apply to, but the success rate was generally quite high. So as long as you put in a decent proposal, you could generally get an additional $150,000 or $200,000 in startup funds over your first couple of years. Again, while you're putting together larger operating grants. There's some sources for equipment funding for new faculty. There's a Canadian Foundation for Innovation program specifically for new people recruited to the university, and so getting some commitment from the university that you're going to be at least eligible, if not nominated for one of those things, can be very helpful. Some other things to consider. Space, I've mentioned already, is really a big issue. You're going to need, obviously, some office somewhere, and you may require both an academic office as well as potentially a clinical office where you might see patients. Lab space, again, if you're primarily wet lab based, having an appropriate amount of lab space to set up your research program and have your trainees in is really critical. And then the clinical space that you're going to be allocated. So again, is that in my case, it's fairly straightforward because a lot of what I do is inpatient-based medicine. So I just show up on the medical wards and see patients, but sometimes I do see patients in a clinic space as well. So I had to be allocated that amount of clinical space and the clinical resources that went with it. And certainly, if if you're a surgeon or something else, having that clinical space is really critical. Some amount of administrative support is really essential. So either through your clinical or your academic appointment, you might be allocated some portion of an administrative assistant's time to help you, and that's I'd say you really don't underestimate the value of that, because as you start putting together grants and doing other things, having someone to help you with some of that part of it is really so important. I'd say also important is thinking about what type of mentorship structure exists. So UBC actually has I think a very good mentorship program for new faculty. It's very organized, very well structured. You get paired up with a senior person who becomes your faculty mentor, and their role is to really advise you and help you navigate the first few years of your appointment, leading up to applying and hopefully being promoted to associate professor. In Singapore, that was much less developed. It was much more sort of ad hoc. But I think looking for what kind of mentorship support exists is helpful. And this would be someone kind of in addition to your research mentors or other mentors that you already have. And then also thinking about what opportunities, the places that you're looking at, what opportunities exist for your partner in terms of work, especially if you're both physicians, thinking about doing, negotiating a package that really meets the needs of both you and your partner is I think potentially very important. Is the city that you're planning on going to the right place for your family, for your children? What support is going to be offered to your children? I think the tuition benefits are one thing that are potentially quite helpful. I'm some years off from making use of that, but hopefully at some point I will be able to. It doesn't cover the MD program, only undergraduate tuition, but again, I think there's, you want to consider kind of the whole beyond just what you need, obviously how this fits into your broader life goals and the people around you. So I'm just going to finish off with just some quick thoughts and then hopefully take some questions. So one thing that surprised me is that it takes a long time to have these conversations and do these negotiations. So, I don't think you can realistically think about doing this in like the year before you're hopefully going to be coming into your position. I felt quite lucky that I had a very supportive department head here at UBC. I actually started talking to him in my first year of residency as an R1. We started having some very general conversations about, what would an academic faculty position look like, and then I really just carried that on for quite some time until we had something in writing about, some more formal commitments. And getting all the support you need and all the different players that I mentioned sort of on the same page and agreeing to what you need does take a long time. So I think it really helps to start thinking about these things early and start having some of the conversations early. One thing that I found was that it seemed to me that it was advantageous to be negotiating with an institution that you're not already at. And so in my case, being in Singapore and negotiating with UBC, I thought there was some advantages to me in terms of the position that I was in and what I was able to negotiate for. I know from speaking to some of my colleagues and peers that are negotiating with the university that they're already at, maybe as a fellow or as a clinical faculty, I think sometimes it's more difficult because there may be a perception that you're already there, they've kind of already got you in to some extent, so there may be less willingness to put together the type of package that you would really hope for to support you. So I think going away, is always helpful for multiple reasons, but having those negotiations from somewhere afar can be really helpful. it really helps to look at, different places. I felt, after when I went through this at NUS, I just had no idea what I was doing, and they gave me this letter of offer. I said, yeah, sure, sounds good. When do I start? And I didn't ask any questions about it. I think when it came to UBC, I felt much better prepared and sort of having some idea what to expect. I interviewed at a couple of other institutions in the US, and I think that was also very helpful to get a bigger picture of kind of what might be on the table from other places. Often it's not totally comparable to your, from university to university, because things can be quite different, but just getting that sense of like what the options are is very helpful. And I think it also makes you much more, to some extent, a more compelling candidate when, people, this whole concept of mimetic desire, the university knows that someone else wants you, they're probably going to be a little bit quicker to act on trying to scoop you up if they know that you've got other options. And then lastly, I guess, I think it's really key to get the commitments being offered to you in writing, in some form of writing, even if it's just an email. For multiple reasons. I know of some of my colleagues who've had discussions with people, and they sort of had some level of verbal commitment that in the end wasn't fulfilled in the way they hope it would be, and it leaves you in quite a precarious position if you don't have anything that you can kind of go to the institution and say, this is what was offered to me. And the second reason being is that there's quite a lot of turnover of people, whether it's the department head or division head or other people. And so because it takes a long time to negotiate these things, if your department head changes halfway through the process and you don't have what they've already offered you in writing, you kind of have to start from scratch when you start that conversation with the next person. So having something down on paper, I think, is really, really crucial. And then lastly, don't forget, they're the ones that are recruiting you. So, and especially I think for you guys as MD PhD students, you guys are going to be so sought after by universities and clinical units. The types of skills that you develop as an MD PhD, your research excellence, your clinical competency. There's really not a lot of people out there that have all of those skills, and so I think you're going to be extremely competitive for really excellent positions, and ultimately it's the universities that are going to be after you guys to try to bring you on board. So that's all I was going to say, and happy to take any questions.
Well, that was inspirational. Any questions for Liam from the group?
You mentioned the CIP program
Yeah.
and doing it during fellowship, and I think I remember you could also do it in residency. So I'm wondering
Yes.
what your thoughts are about doing it in residency versus fellowship, and particularly with internal medicine residency, if that's just nuts.
Yeah, I think it depends. So they're all options. You can do it during. It's quite, especially the UBC CIP, is quite flexible in terms of when you put in that research time. For me, what worked well is because the GIM fellowship, part of it was you could use as research time, and so I was able to use that research time to fulfill my clinical fellowship requirements as well as the CIP requirements. So for me, I felt that worked well. I think the issue of like how much research you should do during residency is always a tricky one. I felt that I needed to do some amount of research during residency because I had just come out of my PhD, and I was, I wouldn't have wanted to stop doing research at that point in time. I felt like I needed some activity to just maintain involved and engaged in the research side. But I think, at the same time, residencies, internal medicine residency, it's only 3 years, and there's a lot to learn in internal medicine. And that's really your time, I think, to really be super focused on developing your clinical skills and clinical knowledge. So I think I wouldn't try to do too much in terms of research during that time. But I think you just have to see what works well. Again, for my personal take is that for internal medicine, I think doing it probably towards the end of your clinical training is good, because then you can use it as a bit of a platform or springboard for your faculty position.
Sure.
To build a bit further on that, how did it work for you to hold CIP here at UBC and then to go away to Singapore?
Yeah, so that was one of the things that for me was appealing about the UBC CIP, is that at least as of now, and I mean this may change at some point, there's no restrictions on where you do your research work. So they will fund you, and if you make a case that, you know, wherever is you know, Barcelona is the place you need to be to do your research, and they will generally be accepting of that. You have some commitments to be part of some of the academic curriculum here, but they generally allow you to do that by teleconference or other means. So that was, yeah, I think not every university is like that, but the UBC CIP is quite flexible that way.
Andrea?
That's actually exactly.
Oh, same question.
And I would say the CIP is nice because it also, it makes you pretty, I mean, you guys are going to be attractive, you know, research fellows or postdoctoral fellows for a variety of reasons, but the fact that you bring your own salary funding with you from CIP, I think makes you very appealing if you want to go work in whoever's lab, wherever in the world. If you can say, you know, I want to come spend 2 or 3 or 4 years in your lab, and by the way, I've got my own funding. I mean, it's you know, I think not a lot of people would say no to that. Also, the level of funding, I think, is generally, you know, a little bit better than what you might expect from if you had just a pure postdoctoral fellowship from CIHR or something like that.
So, does CIP funding go beyond 2 years?
No, it's only 2 years. So I think, yeah, so I think there's, CIP is not perfect, and I think, you know, the concept that you're going to get enough research time within 2 years is maybe not totally realistic, especially if you haven't done a PhD or some other intensive research experience before. So after those 2 years, you would need to
you
have other sources of funds.
CIHR
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
as well,
yeah, no, you'd be
outside.
yeah, you'd be very, very competitive for any of those.
So, and did you have a formal fellowship supervisor at NUS?
A formal fellowship supervisor, no. I had a formal fellowship supervisor at UBC. It would be Michael, yeah.
Okay.
You know, but I had, I'd say, informal research mentors at NUS.
Mm-hmm.
So sorry, how does that work to have informal research mentors? Where was your space at NUS?
Yeah, I was kind of like a junior faculty, so I had sort of my own research group in a more senior scientist's larger research program. So I was given some amount of space within that group, but I was able to hire my own, you know, postdocs and technicians and stuff to do things fairly independently.
This is a completely different situation
Yeah.
than most people have.
That, I think that kind of setup, I haven't seen that exist so much at UBC. In you know, I think in Europe or in other places that's more common, and you have this sort of junior faculty position. I think here at UBC it's probably less.
Under some, you know, high level.
Yes.
Full professors. Rockefeller does that as well.
Right.
David, you had a question?
Yeah. So, did you your faculty appointment in Singapore? Did you see that more as just an advantage over your peers with respect to your CV, or did you see that sort of more as a learning experience for yourself? You sort of mentioned that as well. And to that end, would you recommend that people try and do that?
I mean, I didn't go to Singapore to become a faculty member. I was there to be, you know, do sort of like a research fellowship. When it was offered to me, there didn't really seem to be any downside to it. So, but I don't know that I would say that. Certainly, I don't think that's something you need to do. There are some advantages to it in terms of some of the independence I had there and the opportunities for funding. There may also be some disadvantages to it because there's many grants and awards that are sort of earmarked for new investigators, and so you know, that clock starts when you start your first independent position. And so for me, it maybe started a little bit earlier than it would have otherwise. You know, in my case, I think it worked out fairly well, but I wouldn't say that's something that you would need to do.
But I think something that Ian said about leaving UBC, not only to be negotiating for medicine, but to be seen to have had training and experience outside this institution, I think is really key to getting a position here. I mean, that's what Torsten did. You didn't even really do a fellowship. You kind of did it within your residency, right?
Well, in my residency, I had the option to go away.
Yeah.
Almost 18 your program needs to be comfortable that you're going to pass your exam before they'll give you that kind of slack. But it gave me some of the advantage that Liam did in that I could go to places around the world and say, look, my salary is being taken care of. You know, can I work in your lab? And that makes it a lot easier to get into a top lab pretty much anywhere as long as you're, So.
I'd say the one thing maybe that did help me, by the fact that I had this academic position at NUS, is that as we heard, the CIP funding runs out after 2 years, and initially my plan was I would be coming back after those 2 years, but we weren't quite at the spot in terms of the negotiations with UBC that I was sort of ready to come back. So had I had nothing else at that position, I probably would have, in a way, had to come back and maybe had to have accepted or just had less time to sort of negotiate a position that I would really be happy with. So I think it did help that I had some longer term. I had a position there that in theory I could have stayed in, forever. So that helped because there was less of a sort of pressure on me to feel that I had to have something together, by June 30th to come back to.
Yes, as they say, it's always easier to get a job when you already have a job.
Yeah, exactly.
Sandy, did you have a question? So we don't leave you out.
Yeah.
No? Okay, go ahead.
In your discussion of the letter of offer, you brought up deliverables and timelines for deliverables. I'm just curious, do those deliverables differ dramatically from someone working in a traditional academic position as opposed to as a clinician scientist, or are they fairly on par with traditional academics?
Yeah, I don't think from what I've seen, I don't think they differentiate between being a clinician scientist and being a pure academic. I think where it might differ is if you're in a essentially a clinical department, like in my case, the Department of Medicine, versus a purely academic department like the Department of Biochemistry or something. Sure. There's going to be some difference in terms of certainly the commitments around teaching and stuff, and there might be some differences in terms of the deliverables. But yeah, I wouldn't say that the deliverables are any, certainly not any lower by virtue of being a clinician scientist. Nor do I think they should be. But I think they're probably, if you're in a department that's kind of appropriate for you, then they'll probably be sort of appropriate to what to your situation.
Great.
Eric, you had a question? Did you have a follow-up, Sandy? Sorry. No? Okay.
It was very helpful for you the way you laid out the people that are part of this negotiation of getting position. But is there any formal process by which those people interact with one another, or is it you are responsible for sort of engaging them all?
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't get the sense that there was a formal mechanism by which these people interacted. As I said in my case, my department head basically said to me, we're committing to bring you on. You tell me what research center is going to be the best for you. So it was kind of up to me to identify that person, and then from that stage, I think those people started talking to each other.
They kind of automatically talk to each other. They see a candidate they really want, and for them, although you saw that list of, how do you get all those people to want, actually, each of them thinks it's a deal, because it's like, I only need to pay for part of this guy, and I only need to pay part of this guy, and we get this great person in the department. So they actually spontaneously form a network quickly to try and put together a package, and it does help you get a more competitive package, actually.
Yeah. And it's not like these are, like strangers. I mean, your division head knows your department head, probably knows the center director. And I think, ultimately, at least in my case, the letter of offer contained all of the commitments from everyone, and so it was signed off on by the department head, by the division head, by the center director, by someone representing the healthcare authority. So ultimately, it does all get tied together. But definitely at some stage you'll be talking to various different people, and I think it always helps to get multiple people excited about you and about what you're doing, because it just helps to build more enthusiasm about putting together the right package to bring you on board.
The bottom line is, you go out and get overqualified with an MD, PhD, and all these papers, and people will want you, and a lot of this stuff will happen on its own, actually. Although although it would have been nice to hear a talk like this when I was starting, because I actually think everything you said is pretty close to my experience, actually,
me too.
and Lynn as well. So it's, you guys will have a better idea of exactly what you're getting into, so hopefully that will do to some advantage or make you feel a little less worried. Does anyone feel intimidated about this after, hearing this talk and the talk we had last time from Nadia? She had a different style to reach the same conclusion. Also a junior faculty, but took a more aggressive stance, I guess, is how to go about it. Are you guys...
Can I just ask out of curiosity for deliverables? Was
Yeah.
it any more than the timeline where you're expected to sort of be ready to go out for promotion and what the university criteria are?
It said, in my case, the letter of offer made reference to the department's internal list of deliverables, which were pretty modest. I think it's like half a grant, one publication a year, like one conference presentation. I mean, to me, it seemed like the kind of stuff that, like, if you didn't meet that, be a bit worried about how things are going. So, in Singapore, it was way more detailed. It was like a couple of pages of tables of very detailed number of patents filed, number of students trained, number of papers in journals with impact factor greater than X. So, here.
I've heard that. And what about the U.S. universities, just out of curiosity, you probably wanted to come back to Vancouver.
Yeah, I ended up getting. Yeah, I was interviewed by one center in the U.S. that offered me a position that, in all honesty, was like way better than what was in terms of some aspects of it. The funding that they were able to offer and stuff was sort of like. That's why I was saying it wasn't even comparable to what I could ask for here, but there were other parts of it that to me made it not an appealing position. And obviously, it's got to fit. As I said, it's got to fit in with your life and what. It was in a city that I think, my wife would not have been excited to I said we're moving to here. So I think I think I get the sense that it's quite, but it's still, I felt for me, it was very valuable to just see, what different places might be offering.
Absolutely. You need to, I think that's another thing, just in general, I find, having grown up and trained in the U.S., surprising coming here is that people don't look around. They don't, they get to this point, maybe not clinician scientists, but even like PhDs, they're highly trained and they just want a job in Vancouver. And they're not even willing to consider looking around and getting, you need job offers and you need training elsewhere. Otherwise, it's really hard to come back. A little bit easier for you guys, but.
We can take one last question. It's almost 7 o'clock. Any last questions? Okay, yes, Garrett. Yes, our newly minted PhD. You get the
but it sounds as though you almost, by speaking to the department head, you almost created a position for yourself over time. Would you say that that's typical, or are people often applying for jobs that are posted?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd say rarely do you see a job posted and then you're like, oh, I'm going to just apply for this. The position will generally get created for you. Now, the university does usually have to post that and actually hold an open competition. I sort of laughed when I saw the job description that they posted for my position that was offered to me, because it was so specific. It was like, we're interested in a 6'2" clinician scientist with black curly hair, and it was I would be floored if anyone else applied to it. So yeah, you kind of put it together for sure. And I'd say, that was one thing that in my case, as I said, I was very grateful to have that support from my department head, because from a fairly early stage, he started talking to me about kind of what this might look like. So I think having those conversations early, just to kind of get on people's radar screen and start thinking about it is very helpful. And I think, the going away is super important, but I think it's also gives you a real advantage if you're applying to a place where you're a bit of a known quantity, especially on the clinical side. I think people generally like to hire clinicians that they've worked with before, that they're comfortable with, that they think are going to be, good colleagues. So I think there's advantages to going away, but there's also big advantages to applying to a place that you know and they know you a little bit.
Okay, thank you very much, Dale.
Okay.